satisfação de introduzir essa conversa sobre economia e política para o número 0 da revista Fórum UFRJ. Participarão dessa conversa, em primeiro lugar, a professora Mariana Mazzucato, que é professora de Economia de Inovação e Valor Público da Universidade College de Londres, UCL, onde fundou o Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. É, sem dúvida, uma das mais influentes economistas do momento, e suas principais contribuições são sobre o Estado empreendedor, entrepreneurial state, e sobre políticas orientadas por missão. Nesse momento, Mazzucato está assessorando governos no mundo inteiro, com destaque para a Itália e o Reino Unido, sobre o que será a economia e as políticas públicas no pós-Covid-19. Para conversar, então, com a professora Mazzucato, nós convidamos o vice-reitor da Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro, professor Carlos Frederico Leão Rocha, economista, professor titular do Instituto de Economia da UFRJ, cujas principais contribuições se encontram no campo da economia industrial e da inovação. E também está conosco a economista do BNDES, Lavínia Castro, doutora em Economia e Ciências Sociais, especialista em cenários prospectivos, em estratégias e em bancos de desenvolvimento. Então, eu vou passar agora a palavra para a Lavínia para iniciar essa nossa conversa sobre economia e política.
Well, such a pleasure to be here, a pleasure and an honor to interview Mariana Mazzucato. And we have been talking about this new COVID world. The COVID-19 crisis is a chance to do capitalism differently. You recently said so in an interview to this opinion. And I would like to, just for a kickoff, to start with a broad view. In terms of scenarios, how can you imagine like different post-COVID scenarios, like a bad scenario and a good scenario?
Sure. So first of all, it's wonderful to be here because we are friends and it's terrible not to be able to hug each other closely. But let's do it through the conversation. We'll be as passionate as we always are. I believe that, we really are at a turning point. It can go either way. And I really hope that this becomes a massive wake-up call to especially the idea that we cannot go back to normal. Many of us want to go back to normal. I have 4 children and I can't wait for them to get out of the house and go back to school. So in that sense, I think we are craving normality in all sorts of ways, including hugging each other. However, we should remember that so much of the extent to which this crisis has affected us all has to do with how the normality before was part of the problem, both in terms of how we have allowed, the climate to be decimated. There is a connection, in fact, if we read the science, between how we have lost control, if you want, of our production structures and agriculture. We are coming closer and closer to animals, because of how we are hurting the planet, but also we are not prepared for some of the viruses coming our way because of how we are producing, how we are distributing, how we are consuming. And there's a real issue of what that means for constructing a new way of producing, distributing, and consuming. But much more specifically, at least in the UK and in Europe where I am, the degree to which our health systems, literally the healthcare industry, in the UK, it's the National Health Service, was unprepared for this, has a lot to do with the lack of value, if you want, that we have placed on our welfare states. So the degree to which, we are clapping our health workers on Thursdays, but if over time the health service itself has become weaker and weaker, it has been outsourced increasingly to the private sector, but especially the capacity within the state to really manage health in the sense of well-being of the citizens has been reduced. And so we have realized, I think globally right now, that we are only as healthy as our neighbors are, literally on the streets we live in the cities we live in the nations we live in, and globally. Had this crisis begun in Africa and not in China, it would have been much, much worse for the world. So the degree to which we allow this crisis to really wake us up to the fact that we have not been valuing and funding and resourcing some of the most important parts of our economy, I hope at least, will be one of the biggest wake-up calls. I don't know in Brazil, but here we call, the health workers key workers. In the US, they call them essential workers. And I think the bigger question is, have we lost track on the essential part of the economy? And can we use this crisis to bring back a conversation of how to value, how to resource all the different types of institutions, organizations, instruments, relationships, which make us all, healthier in that broad sense of well-being. And so it's a real danger to talk about going back to normal, stopping the lockdown to go back to normal, when again, the normal we realized was part of the problem.
Well, talking specifically about cooperation, a word that needs more cooperation, and thinking about health specifically, the pandemic revealed the worldwide dependence on China's equipment and masks, but also on Indian pharmaceutical inputs, for example. So what will be the future? Division of labor for production and for innovation, the role of cooperation in the health industry. Where do you see room for cooperation, and will competition prevail?
I mean, I think there's always been cooperation. It's just been a problematic form of cooperation. If we think of, vaccine production or any sort of drug and medicine production, it's always been a cooperation between, the state, biotech companies, large pharmaceutical companies, increasingly third sector, so nonprofit institutions. The problem is how they work together. What is the actual division of labor, and how is it being governed? And I think one of the really important issues now is, as we are racing, towards a vaccine, how do we govern that process? And we know that, just by looking at how we have governed other parts of the health sector, that it's been problematic in the sense that even though there's a lot of public money going in, then we don't govern, for example, the patent system in the right way. So patents, the intellectual property rights are too strong, they're too upstream, they're too wide. So, we really need to be what I call mission oriented, and the mission should be to have a vaccine which is universally accessible by everyone and, for free. And so that requires a real eye in governance structure and negotiation and a symbiotic mutualistic relationship, not a parasitic one between the state and, the pharmaceutical companies. And it's both in terms of intellectual property rights. We can use patent pools. We can use much more collaboration so we don't get secrecy. We really need as much learning and collaboration and learning by doing internationally as possible, but also this whole issue of the access, the degree to which this will not hopefully be used as a for-profit affair. And, this is, I think, a broader issue, which is the issue of conditionalities. That there will be huge amounts of public investments in different parts of the health industry that we require. It's not just vaccines. And the degree to which we can really use this moment to rethink how to build ecosystems that really are mutualistic through this idea of conditionalities, both for the bailouts, which perhaps we'll get to later in the conversation, but also much more specifically around, the specific parts of the health industry itself. There's been too few conditionalities in the past. If you look at how drug development has occurred, again, with lots of socialization of risks, but then privatization of the rewards. And we simply cannot afford to do that this time, given how many lives are at stake.
Mariana, let me enter here.
Yeah.
As you've been talking about the production of knowledge in the pharmaceutical industries and the health industry as a whole. But one of the main problems we have been going through is that when countries needed inputs, they were organized in production chains that were globally organized. And these production chains, in some sense, they have dismantled due to some interruption of production in some countries. And in other ways, there were moments that countries kept the inputs for them and didn't share them with other countries. Do you think there will be a tendency for countries to nationalize those industries, to produce domestically some of these inputs? And how do you think that countries like Brazil, specifically, but Latin America in general, latecomers, can work in the learning and capability accumulation and the state role in this scenario?
I think that's a really interesting question, and I think there's two separate issues. One is international collaboration, and on the science part of the situation, I think it has to be not only international, but especially to structure that collaboration in such a way that really fosters learning between countries and as much exchange and solidarity, if you want, between them. However, even with all that international collaboration, solidarity, and governance of the process in such a way that I was talking about before, you still need national capacity. And what's extraordinary is in countries like the United Kingdom, again, where I'm sitting today, the deindustrialization of the economy has also been associated with a financialization of the economy. So it's not just that we don't have a lot of manufacturing, it's that the types of services that we have are basically financial services. That is very different from, say, Denmark, where they also have a huge service sector, but that service sector is actually servicing a real vision of the country around a green transition. So Denmark apparently is the #1 provider of high-tech services to China's green transition, and China is spending 1.7 trillion on greening its entire economy. So there is a question of what kind of services, what kind of manufacturing, what kind of industrialization or deindustrialization do we have? And so in both the US and the UK, or let's just talk about the US for a minute, they have something that's called the Defense Production Act from 1950, from the Korean War, which gives the government the ability to really transform production structures, say like they did in the World War II, where the automobile sector and production plants were transformed very quickly to make the wartime needs. And the degree to which we still have that kind of industrial capacity in anything to transform to produce something like ventilators is really in question. So, you know, you cannot turn a hedge fund into a ventilator. You can, in Italy, for example, ask the Ferrari plant, you know, the Ferrari automotive plant to produce ventilators. Or here in the UK, there's the Dyson, you know, vacuum cleaners, which are quite famous globally. That was a production structure that was able to interact with the government in its demand to help the government produce enough ventilators. Or Burberry, you know, the Burberry brand, those nice coats, they helped make some of the personal protective equipment. But it's too random. It's very idiosyncratic, both in terms of the lack actually of enough productive capacity, but also what I have found fascinating is the lack of capacity of the government to even know how to engage with industry. And one thing I wrote about recently is that part of the outsourcing problem of outsourcing so much public sector capacity to the private sector has resulted also in a lack of understanding of even how to write the contracts, how to write the terms of reference. So it's literally the consulting companies like Deloitte, or there's, I don't know if you know them, but there's two large private companies called Serco and G4S, which do a lot of the outsourcing of government services like prison management or hospitals. They are so, you know, they almost have a control of the government's ability to even write the contracts that are required for the public and private sectors to engage. So in a moment like this, where government needs a lot of ventilators, or now we're beyond that, but still a lot of personal protection equipment, from masks to what they require in the hospitals, what was striking was both those things: the lack of actual material, the lack of enough productive structure to transform with something like the Defense Production Act, and the lack of ability to know how to manage that relationship with the private sector, even, you know, had they even had that productive capacity. And that's what I mean by a wake-up call. I really hope that we realize we cannot continue to think that all you need to do is think about, you know, this mythological concept of somehow, you know, Industry 5.0, where it's all going to be AI, or it's all about services, or at best the creative sector, and all this other stuff doesn't matter. Of course, we move on with the economy. We need to be thinking about new technology, new production systems, the decentralized network of our economy. However, if you no longer know how to make, you have a problem. But how we make, how we contract, how we collaborate, what kind of structures we construct for public, private, and third sector and civil society institutions to organize themselves, I think that's going to be one of the big questions.
It's very interesting that you have stressed the point about ventilators. Our university has come with a ventilator, and it needed a production facility. And then we had some alumni that were engineers at Whirlpool. And so they very rapidly came with a solution to produce them in Whirlpool. But now we have an important limitation. Who takes the risk?
Right.
Yes, who takes
you know, who has the risk that if some patient dies or something bad happens, who is going to be responsible for that? And in the past, there were BNDES, where Lavínia works, had an important role just organizing this kind of agreement or combination, but now it has disappeared from it. So it's important that we go back to things that we knew how to do, and now we just forgot, or we don't have the capacity because things have been changed.
Yeah, this is
I've been a risk manager for a while, and I believe that risk managing is not avoiding the risk, it's dealing with the risk.
Yeah.
And the ones who have capacity have to build the contracts in order to face the risk and make things go further.
But also, you know, I mean, one thing that always impressed me with BNDES, at least in a particular period of its history when I was first learning about them, when I first met you, Lavínia, was I thought it was very interesting, the level of confidence that it had when, for example, it was asked by the companies that were making generic drugs, which were worried that they were all being bought up by foreign pharmaceutical companies, which were keeping the Brazilian name, of course, so that it looked like it was still Brazilian, but increasingly it was becoming through these big global company production. When they asked BNDES for help, I remember, I think it was Carlos Cadelia who told me, I can't remember, that there was some conditions attached. They said, fine, but if we're gonna help you, a state structure, a public bank, then you need to ensure us that when you make generic drugs, you don't not think of the citizen, right? So 5 pills a day to take is too much. You know, if you're living in a favela and have a very difficult life because, you know, things are very complex, it's easier if you have a pill to take once or twice a day. So literally at the level of the prescription, how many dosages a day you take matters if you're thinking of it in the public interest, right? You want it something that's going to be easier to take for citizens. And so if the state is helping a private enterprise in a moment of crisis, whether it's the health crisis, a financial crisis, a climate crisis, or a globalization crisis like this situation that I'm referring to, it's good for the state to think how, not just whether to help business or not, but how. How can we structure the assistance in such a way that meets a public interest test? And in that sense, I agree with you, Lavínia, and I wrote a lot about this in my recent books, which is we need to change the narrative. It's not about de-risking, but really sharing the risks and then sharing the rewards. And how you share the rewards can both be financial, but also through the conditions that you attach and the governance structures, again, in the public interest.
I think Professor Ana Célia wanted to make a comment.
No, I was thinking about the recent period. I mean, we build a government capacity, and then in the recent period, you are deregulating or deconstruction the capacity we built in so many years, and now you have to rebuild the capacities because we need them. It's definitely we need the state capacities to do everything you are saying. And it's crucial. I mean, that's my comment. I mean, we passed by a period of deconstruction of state capacities, and you have to have a new period for rebuilding the state capacities for doing everything.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things we do in the Institute, which I set up, which you know, both of you have visited, is we say that state capacity depends on what you think the state is for. So if you think that at best the state is there to fix market failures, it's not obvious why you need state capacity, because you're just fixing something kind of too little too late after, you know, after the fact. If instead the framework is really about co-shaping and co-creating markets, the fact that you are literally co-creating and doing and learning by doing, and have to, you know, create that absorptive capacity as the business literature talks about, then it's much more important to have that capacity. And so it's nice to talk about state capacity, but if it's not linked to a different theory and framing of what the state is even for, then it sort of doesn't happen. So these two issues of building the capacity, but also creating a new economics framework really has to happen in hand.
Yeah, this is a very interesting point, because actually to reduce the state capacities, we also have to think it's a new word in terms of the relation between the state and civil society.
Yes.
So like, for example, there are new actors, and there are like the internet society, I mean, a net society that requires much more dialogue with the state, that we didn't used to have. It used to be like, for example, at the NDS, an insulate bureaucracy, very competent, but very insulate from the civil society and from like many requires. So still, and then I will ask you a question, because you also mentioned about the relation between the private sector, civil society, and the state, and I would like to explore that more, because it's interesting, because as Marco Zambuja said another day, a very interesting thing, that it's kind of like, seems like it's obvious in some sense, but it's not, that history likes big facts. I mean, the tendencies are already there.
Yeah.
But then you have a fact change, and then it opens to a different word. I mean, like milestones. And then the word, you could see a lot of tensions in capitalism before the crisis already. Yeah. The dispute between the United States and China was already there. And then it's coming like more clear, inequalities, rising inequalities, and so on. So if you look to the word before COVID, it was already possible to see like private philanthropic movements gaining strength, for example. So the COVID crisis seems to have accentuated and pushed this new tendency further. So will philanthropic and private corporate donations be relevant as promoters of social environment development agendas in the future? Will they be enough? And if they are not enough, are these risks of overlap, new exclusion? Who will monitor the effectiveness of this uncoordinated action? So I think we have to think as put them into discussion as well, how to deal and cooperate with that.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. You know, there's this great book, Winner Takes All, which looks at the very problematic way in which the philanthropies, in some ways, have, you know, not all of them, but a lot of them have come about precisely because large companies have been able to save so much money in terms of not paying tax, or, you know, again, governing the production process in such a way that fuels short-term profits, not long-term growth, that there's been large cash piles that they almost don't know what to do with, which then fuels the funds for the philanthropy. So the real question of how do we not really think about philanthropies, but changing our production models that be less financialized and also really create a tax structure which gives back money to the socially collective wealth creation process, instead of all this value extraction, which occurs also from the tax evasion of many companies, which then again set up their philanthropic kind of funds, right? And so that's just kind of a fact, I think, of what we've seen over time. But the question is, even when we have the kind of good philanthropies, because of course they're helpful, you know, the Gates Foundation is absolutely great in the health sector. The problem is if there's a correlation between the rise of philanthropies and their power in some ways over particular sectors and the lack of capacity in the state, so they are somehow filling the gap that's created by the whole, created of this lack of capacity, both on the financial side, but especially on the quantitative side from state structures, then that's a huge problem. And we shouldn't almost get addicted to that those philanthropic funds. We need to change the degree to which, you know, the state doesn't lack that capacity. Now, even when you have a strong state and a strong private sector, the question becomes, what is the role of philanthropies? And I don't know, I mean, I think it's an open question. I think it's just as interesting to say, what is the role of the state? Because often it's just, again, fixing, right? So even in the health sector, even in the US, where the state spends a lot, 40 billion a year from the National Institutes of Health, if you look at the direction of that spending, it's not always obvious whether it's the right direction, right? So it can also be that the state itself is simply putting money in areas because the private sector has decided not to. It's decided to move down the chain in the less risky areas. So in that sense, the state should stop and ask itself, how can it create, again, the conditionalities to make sure that the private sector itself is investing, is not using all these share buybacks, is reinvesting the profits, as opposed to just reacting to it by putting in even more public money in particular parts of science that are devoid of private funds. Similarly with philanthropies, I think both the state and the philanthropy should really be a thorn in the side, constantly shifting the landscape, you know, redefining what we even mean by health. And in that sense, I've often thought that the NIH itself has become pharmaceuticalized. All the research is on drugs. There's very little on diagnostics, on surgical treatments, on lifestyle. And both philanthropies and the state, I think, should actually be in their own way, because they are different, of course, redefining the market itself instead of just, you know, filling gaps. And if they're not doing that, they are in some ways justifying and reproducing the problematic system, which in theory they're trying to sort of correct, but because they're not an active and proactive player. But the philanthropies are, of course, different from the state. And when you don't have an active state role, the role of the philanthropies gets, you know, potentially bigger and bigger. And that's what you then talk about in terms of uncoordinated or ungoverned, because it's not the role of the philanthropies to govern a system. That's the role, in some ways, of government in at least countries that have democracies.
Let me go, I think, on the last question, but right now we have a tendency towards home office. This tendency was there before the COVID-19 crisis, but it's there. Now we have everyone working at home. And what I see is that before the Industrial Revolution, people used to work at home. And now we are going back to work at home as well. But during this period, when factories were created and the production was centralized in one place, knowledge was captured by management. Now, the production is going to be decentralized again, or is being decentralized again. How do you think knowledge will behave? Where will it be accumulated? What knowledge flows should be established? And this has a lot to do about power. Who has the power here? And what is the state role in organizing labor market in that way?
I mean, it's such an interesting question, and it could go in many different directions. The first direction, of course, is the issue of the digital divide. It's nice to pretend that we're all working at home in a similar way, but even our children, how they're being educated at home, as they, if they don't have access to good broadband or even to a room of their own, remember Virginia Woolf's fantastic book, A Room of One's Own, that if you don't have a room of your own, you cannot think, you cannot study. Children of different social class backgrounds currently are being educated in fundamentally different ways when they are at home because of the different access that people have to the online world, literally the level of broadband, any computer in the house, the amount of credit on a phone. So, you know, we are not all in it together. It's much easier for my children and your children to be educated than so many other people. Even here in London, the digital divide is immense, immense. And similarly, working at home, you know, some jobs, yes, we can work at home. We academics can probably do it from anywhere on top of a mountain. Many jobs you cannot work at home. And so that's a first point, because that, I think, does come back to the issue of government in terms of how it governs digital platforms. And because so much of the technology, at least in the developed world, was actually funded by government, the digital technology from internet, GPS, the fact it then didn't get governed in such a way, as I mentioned before, with kind of public interest, public value, common good, as the Vatican would say, because I'm actually working with the Vatican on their COVID task force, then we have a problem, because you put in all this money in the digital platforms, and then we don't govern it to make sure that citizens actually benefit, similarly as we were talking about in the health sector. Separately, though, is the issue of work. And I think, you know, it's a much broader issue than just about working at home. I think we have really woken up to the need to think about something like UBI, Universal Basic Income. Anytime you have a crisis, you can't just have people not being able to put food on the table because they're waiting for the crisis to finish, you know, the vaccine to arrive or the furlough schemes to start. So having some level, a proper level of guarantee, you know, basically a welfare state guarantee, but also through particular types of income channels that make sure that everyone preserves their human rights to enough food, good food, proper education, proper health care, no matter what, no matter if it's a financial crisis or a health crisis or a huge climate crisis like the floods and the fires that we were experiencing, that we have been experiencing over the last years. You know, we should all remember we were clapping the firefighters in Australia and California, the flood workers in Venice, where I'm from that part of Italy. You know, it's not enough, as I said in the beginning, to clap them. We need to be asking ourselves, what are the structures, the institutional, the organizational structures that we require to safeguard us against the crises, but also that in the good times are directed and constructed in such a way that are governed for, you know, with real kind of public purpose and public goals. And the UBI issue, I think it's interesting. I mean, people have different opinions. Personally, I don't like the narrative of UBI because it's like a handout. I think if we construct our world around us so that if we think of, you know, Amartya Sen's concept of capabilities, that we all need certain types of capabilities, basic capabilities, in order even to access the opportunities that are out there in 21st century capitalism, then we need to be resourcing and constructing new institutions also that really help nurture those capabilities in every human being, no matter what, you know, class background, ethnic background, racial background. And if you do that, that is an extremely strong way also to safeguard society, to make sure that people are all equally ready and resilient in hard times. And that's an institutional issue. So making sure we have good social housing, good public education that is as good as it can be, good technology access for everybody, not just, you know, the middle class and above, so that when you do have a lockdown, everyone can continue to be educated equally. But also this issue of making sure that there's literally cash flow to families to still buy food and get food on the table. In Camden, where I live in London, there's many families that are, I don't want to say, you know, starving, but literally do not have food to put on the table and are having to, you know, go to the philanthropies, to the local food banks, which are unfortunately empty. I've discovered in London that most people who donate to food banks are poor. And now those people have literally no money. They can no longer donate because they have gone through the experience of not having food. And so they realize how important it is. So they donate food to the food banks. And because it's so difficult now, they can't do that. But we cannot run a society based on food banks in the same way that we were saying before. We cannot run a society based on charity. It has to be embedded within the structures that we're setting up. So I don't know where the state of the conversation is in Brazil. on the universal basic income. But, you know, having both the income, but especially the resources and institutions and organizations that make everyone equally resilient to periods of crisis, I think is the broader question.
I want to finish the conversation here, just to profit from the last words you said, were fantastic, fascinating. And I would say that you are adding so many other layers and tasks, important tasks to policy-oriented, to mission-oriented policies. So I think we should end here. And I thank you so much. It was wonderful, was fascinating, was really thoughtful and important and crucial for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.